You're listening to Two Broads Talking Politics with special guest Katrina Gamble.
Are you listening?
Hi everyone, this is Kelly with Two Broads Talking Politics, part of the Demcast family of podcasts, coming to you from quarantine where I believe my whole family is on Zoom calls of some sort right now. And I am joined today by Katrina Gamble, who is the owner and principal of Sojourn Strategies. Hi Katrina.
Hi Kelly, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you for joining me. So just to create some background, tell me a little bit about Sojourn Strategies, what this is, what sorts of stuff you work on, and how it got started.
Sure, of course. So Sojourn Strategies is a social impact consulting firm that I started a little over 4 years ago now. And what we do is we work with mostly nonprofits and also philanthropic organizations, providing strategic advice on voting rights and democracy issues, criminal justice reform, and election and politics. And previously, before I started Sojourn Strategies, I was the political director of a national social justice organization where I started their voting rights and democracy program and supported state-based grassroots organizations across the country to move both civic engagement, voter outreach, and electoral programs, as well as supporting them to move pro-democracy reforms in their states. And so after doing that for about 5 years, I started Sojourn Strategies just so that I could have the flexibility to be able to work in more places and also work on a variety of other different types of issues. And so that was in the beginning of 2016 is when I started Sojourn Strategies.
Good timing.
In some ways, yes.
So we'll sort of dive into in a little bit what things look like right now in the midst of everything that's going on. But prior to this pandemic, what was sort of the state of play on voting rights around the country?
Yeah, so for the work that one of the major clients that I work with, one of the things that we focus on is working with groups in states to move pro-democracy reforms that make our elections more secure and accessible to voters. Things like automatic voter registration, same-day registration, rights restoration, all of the things that you would say, things that just make it make casting a ballot more accessible for people across the country. And so I think pre-COVID, now we think pre-COVID, post-COVID in my mind in a lot of ways. You saw in a number of states organizations pushing for those reforms, or in places where things had recently passed, making sure that new policy reforms were implemented properly. And then also in some places, also there are organizations who have been organizing to also protect the vote against things that may have been more regressive in nature. And so it was like a mixture of things. And so what that looked like really varied from state to state. And an example of a state where pre-COVID there was an active campaign to move lots of pro-democracy reforms is Virginia. There was a suite of voting rights reforms that passed in Virginia during their legislature this year. And then post-COVID, a lot of those laws just got signed into law by the governor there just last week.
So this, in theory, wouldn't need to be a partisan issue. It seems like very often it is. Are there any places that you can think of that maybe would be more surprising in that regard? Places that are either places we think of as really blue states where voting rights are not so great, or places that we think of red states where actually a lot of this is being done well?
We definitely shouldn't think of this as a partisan issue. From my perspective, voting and democracy is definitely nonpartisan, and all of the reforms that I mentioned, regardless of one's ideology or party, are all things that make accessing the ballot and casting one's ballot more accessible. So it's really not about politics. It's really about ways of strengthening our democracy and increasing ways in which people can make sure their voice is heard within the process. And so, for example, a couple of years ago when I was working with groups on an automatic voter registration campaign in Illinois and also in Maryland, those are states that have democratically controlled state legislatures, but at the time when these laws passed, had Republican governors. And so you had Republican governors passing automatic voter registration in places that had blue state legislatures. And so in a lot of ways, these are just laws that make our elections more efficient and more secure and more fair.
All right, so that's sort of the where we were pre-COVID. So it seems like there is increased attention on this now, sort of during COVID, post-COVID, both in terms of sort of what does it look like as people are actually trying to cast ballots in primary elections, and then thoughts about November and what could be done. What are some of your particular concerns? Let's start there. Like, what are the issues we really need to be thinking about as we try to develop strategies and solutions?
Right. Yeah. So obviously 2020, it's a major election year for the United States across the country. And so when the COVID-19 emergency really started spreading across the country and the stay-at-home orders were happening. And obviously there was just lots of uncertainty for all of us in all different aspects of our lives about how to just go about functioning under this existing emergency. And so that uncertainty obviously also translates into how we're going to administer our elections under a state of emergency, and doing it in a way that allows for people to both stay safe as well as also protecting our democracy. And so I think that is kind of the underlying question is, how do we do both? How do we both stay safe and healthy, and also how do we maintain the integrity of our elections? And what we've seen over the last few weeks across the country is that states are really digging in to try to figure out like what that means. For some states that had elections that were coming up really quickly in early March, that meant postponing elections to later in the year. Some were postponed to May, some were postponed to June. And so that's like one question is just like, when elections are being held. And then the other question is, how do we administer elections in this current moment? And like, what does that look like? And so, in some states that has meant expanding access to vote by mail in various different ways, and also working to ensure in-person voting options for people who need to access that are safe and are aligning with all of the social distancing and public health orders that we use when we go about doing other essential tasks in our lives during the current emergency.
So you just mentioned people who still need to vote in person. That, you hear a lot about kind of the solution. Oh, this is just we all switch to voting by mail all the time. But, I get the sense that is not a panacea. That doesn't fix everything. So what are some of the concerns with moving to an all vote by mail system?
Yeah, so definitely I think that expanding vote by mail as much as we can, wherever we can, is incredibly important under the current state of emergency. Limiting the number of people who have to go cast a ballot in person will help with all of the things that we're concerned about with the coronavirus outbreak, which is social distancing, avoiding crowds, avoiding people having to stand in long lines. And so when people are able to cast a ballot by mail or do an absentee ballot and put it in a drop box, that obviously will limit the number of people who have to go out and cast a ballot on election day. However, some concerns with that are, first, in a lot of places when you hear states are mailing everyone who's a registered voter a ballot or mailing everyone who's a registered voter an absentee ballot, application form, what that really means is that they're mailing everyone who's an active registered voter a ballot. And what that means from state to state differs, but basically what an active registered voter means is that the county clerks or the Secretary of State have an accurate address for that person. And so people who may have moved recently, people who tend to be more transient, young people, lower income people, they may not be actually getting a ballot in the mail or an absentee ballot request form in the mail. And so those individuals need other ways to cast their ballot. And then there are also certain other communities where voting by mail may pose certain challenges. For example, individuals with certain disabilities may need to access in-person voting. Folks who may need certain language assistance may need access to voting in person. And then I've also heard from a number of individuals who are in the Native community and indigenous communities or you are in rural areas where mailing addresses don't necessarily fit like our traditional mail addresses, may have a harder time casting a ballot and getting access to vote by mail. So what we know is that what most people want is having both, ensuring that there are choices. So expanding vote by mail as much as we can and moving people to use that who can, but also we want to make sure, as we're pushing to make sure that we're administering elections and that we're moving forward with our democracy under this emergency, that we're not inadvertently disenfranchising people by cutting off in-person voting options. And so really what we want to do is have both and have both options be as safe as possible.
Are you concerned at all that if the USPS shuts down or, has to cut back service, that's going to affect the vote by mail situation?
I mean, obviously that's a concern that folks have raised. For lots of reasons, I hope that we continue to figure out how to ensure that doesn't happen in our country. And it also, when we say vote by mail, it doesn't also mean just everyone has to drop a ballot in mail. A lot of places, in a lot of states, there are also drop boxes where people can go and drop off their ballot in these boxes. And then also, and this is another reason why we want to make sure that there are also in-person voting options, as there's increased pressure on USPS and the mail system to ensure that that's not the only way in which people can cast their ballot.
What are some action items for people to take? There's various legislation that's being proposed nationally at state levels to address some of this. There's some places where it's not that hard to do vote by mail legally now. There just needs to be a push for people to sign up to do that. So what would you recommend that people who are thinking about organizing around this do as sort of the next steps to make sure that election is safe in November?
Right. So I think there are several things that individuals can do. One is just understanding what is happening in your particular state. And so each state is handling this differently. Most states are in the process right now of actively figuring out how they're going to administer elections under the COVID-19 emergency. You can go, there's a site called wecanvote.us that provides information about election administration, the status of things in various states. And so that's one place, that's one resource where individuals can just go and understand, what is my Secretary of State doing? Has my governor issued an emergency proclamation around elections? Has the election date changed and what has it changed to? Just to get a sense of the status of things. So that's one, just to educate and understand where things are in your state. Second is, if things aren't moving, figuring out ways to advocate for a process in your state that will allow for an accessible and fair and transparent election for all eligible voters. And so that means expanded vote by mail. That means has your state considered extending early voting options so that people can vote well before Election Day, So those who need to vote on election day, it's a much smaller number. What are the steps that states are taking to ensure that polling locations are safe and are meeting up with CDC guidelines? And so either your Secretary of State, or if there's individuals in your state legislature who you can advocate to make sure that those things are happening, I think that's incredibly important. And then I think for a number of organizations who typically do civic engagement, voter registration, and GOTV work, one of the big things, I think, challenges going forward, and a lot of the focus that the work will need to be on, is voter education. So in states where vote by mail already exists, maybe there's less of that to do, but for many states, expanding vote by mail, the changing of election dates, understanding how one can go vote in person will be a moving target for most average voters. And so I think large-scale voter education, making sure individuals understand how they can access an absentee ballot in a particular state, what they need to do in order to cast their ballot by mail, if they're going to be voting on election day, what does that look like? What types of safety precautions do they need to take for themselves when they're going to cast a ballot in person? And so I think the expanded voter education will be like a major, major push for organizations who engage in this type of civic engagement and voter education work typically.
I've never actually voted by mail. I live in Illinois. I live in Illinois, where it's very easy to do, but because we have kids, we've always voted in person so we could take them with us and have that whole experience. And talked to the kids told them, well, we're going to vote by mail this November. And they were like, oh, that's great. We can all work on it together at home. And I was like, oh, right, we can do that still. So you also mentioned that you work with criminal justice reforms. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about what the criminal justice system is experiencing in the midst of COVID, the very serious concerns about outbreaks in prisons and jails, and what people should be keeping an eye on and working on in that regard.
Yeah, so this has been like a huge, major issue. As you can imagine, jails and prisons are places already typically with major concerns around like living conditions in those facilities. And so in a moment when we are in a pandemic and people are in close proximity to each other, individuals who have pre-existing health conditions and may not necessarily have access to proper health care, ensuring like the humane and proper treatment for people who are in jail and prisons is incredibly important. And so there have been a number of organizations who are been pushing for the release of individuals. And then there's the concern too, is also like providing individuals who are released with proper resources and safety nets once they are released. They may have been exposed to COVID-19 while in jail and then re-entering communities. And so how are we providing those individuals with the ability to self-quarantine and also like be able to transition back into our community safely? And so those are a lot of concerns, and pushing for prosecutors and others who can to stop requiring money bail, which is was a major issue pre-COVID. And so they're, putting people in jail simply because of whether or not they're poor is like a huge problem in this country. And you can imagine unnecessarily putting people in that position during this pandemic is a major challenge.
Do you think that this is an issue that people are paying more attention to? You noted that these were already problems that existed pre-COVID. Is this a time that we can sort of really shine a light on the issues of cash bail, on the issues of, overcrowding in jails, and maybe really make some reforms moving forward?
Yeah, so I mean, there were a number of organizations, one of whom I have like worked with previously, like Color of Change, and a number of organizations in states that have been pushing on these issues for a really, really long time. And one way that they've done that is through what folks have called the prosecutor accountability movement. So like pushing prosecutors who have an immense amount of power on a number of these issues to take certain actions. And I mean, I think like across like a number of issues, like I think with access to healthcare, right? And a lot of the economic issues that are really coming to light for certain people under the current emergency were issues that existed before this emergency. And so I think a number of organizations are working to make sure that some of the changes that we're pushing for now are not temporary, but more permanent. And so, yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And when we're talking about these things, and that's the reason why I said that, is understanding that these are not new challenges that we're facing because of COVID-19. These are just challenges that are revealing themselves in more stark ways for more people because of this crisis. And so just making a temporary fix is really, it's a temporary fix. And so if there are ways as we're advocating for these changes to make them more sustainable and more long-term, then that's obviously a much better path forward.
Is there anything else that you would like to make sure that we talk about today?
I think the only thing that I would say is that I feel like this is a moment where we all, it's a tough moment, I think, for all of us while we're both trying to manage our own lives and families and keep ourselves safe and healthy, while we also just need to be really kind of vigilant and paying attention to like what's happening, what changes are happening around our democracy, and making sure that as we're making very fast and quick, urgent changes to be able to respond to certain needs around administering elections under the current emergency, while we're making those changes, that we're making sure we're not inadvertently disenfranchising or harming certain communities because we're trying to move quickly. And so I think we have to move both quickly and also very intentionally and thoughtfully about the types of policies and reforms we're pushing, and making sure that whatever we're doing, that all eligible voters have access to the ballot and are able to cast their ballot during this, these primaries and the November elections that are coming up.
Yeah, that's a great reminder. Thank you. Well, Katrina, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. These issues are so important. Were so important before, but are really being highlighted now. And I am so thankful to get your expertise on this. And I hope that people will really think about things that they can do moving forward to make these elections as safe as possible.
Thank you, Kelly. I appreciate being on.
Thank you for listening to Two Broads Talking Politics, part of the Dimcast Podcast Network. Our theme song is called Are You Listening? Off of the album Elephant Shaped Trees by the band Immunuri, and we're using it with permission of the band. Our logo and other original artwork is by Matthew Weflin and was created for use by this podcast. You can contact us at twobroadstalkingpolitics@gmail.com or on Twitter or Facebook at twobroadstalk. You can find all of our episodes at twobroadstalkingpolitics.com or anywhere podcasts are found.